Okay, so we just started the recording. I guess where I would like to start is sort of the basic question of what did people think of the play Lovers' Vows, and yeah, just thoughts about the play. And we usually are not very formal, so people can just speak up whenever they want, and usually that works out fine.
I actually enjoyed the play. It was not what I was expecting it to be. I had never read it before, and so my image of it from Mansfield Park was it must be really racy and really just horrible. And it really wasn't, other than it was a single mom who had a child out of wedlock. But on the whole, it was a very nice little play.
Yeah, I think that for us reading it, we can't maybe understand why it was so controversial. But when you read like the criticism about it, there is a lot of controversy about it in the like papers at the time, like newspaper reviews of the play. So
I think that Inchbald, especially in her preface, notes that she has made a lot of changes. And I looked into that just a little bit. And in fact, Susan Ford, in her new book on reading in Jane Austen's books, talks about the fact that it is sanitized, that the original play called Love Child in German was really a much more political document in the societal way, but Inchbald kind of reduces it to just the domestic, private, individual concerns, which limits the players in, and that's what Jane Austen would have been familiar with too. Anyway, that's what I read.
Well, after reading the play, I think Mr. Rushworth was the perfect person to be the Count.
except the Count actually had a little bit more going on upstairs than Rushworth did.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
At least the Count could flirt verbally, even though
Yeah.
he had no morals.
Yeah.
I wonder if the time period, the French Revolution and people overthrowing the government, when you hearken back to Tale of Two Cities, where this terrible lord is taking advantage of a beautiful young peasant girl, maybe that's kind of the shocking thing. I know England later on seemed to be very much afraid that the disease of republicanism, or whatever you would call it, with people seizing power from the throne, might spread to them. So if German duchies or whatever were afraid of that too, they would also react more strongly than we do to the storyline.
Yeah, I think Diana's question is interesting in the sense of like, a lot of times it's hard to understand why there was within Mansfield Park, why there was so much discussion about the play. And yeah, and I think reading the stage directions like that maybe gives a little more sense of like, oh, why is Mariah and Henry playing mother and son so potentially dangerous? And you really have to read the stage directions to sort of figure that one out.
I don't know if there was a difference between the two versions that we had a chance to read, and I read the second one, not the Gutenberg, but the other one. But in any case, I was really impressed by how clever the butler's rhymes were. And they were quite funny. And then in another part of the poetry, they talked about sort of spoofed the Gothic influence on the literature of the time. Like, I'm not going to have a castle, and I'm not going to have this poor heroine that is in a difficult place, and I thought it was quite clever, some of these things that were worked into the thing. And as far as the rhyme too, there was another rhyme where they said, well, if it's in rhyme, then it has to be true, that poetry is always true. But in any case, there were several things within the poetry part that I thought were quite engaging.
Did anyone else think that the contrast between the comic and the melodrama was just a bit too sharp sometimes? Sometimes it was like real head spinning. Particularly, there was just certain characters that were obviously there for comic relief. But sometimes I was just trying to figure out if this was actually on the stage, the contrast might be a little bit too disruptive. I don't know. Did anyone else feel that way?
I think that to me it felt, yeah, like there were parts that felt very farcical and then parts that were more dramatic. And to me, that sort of felt like how Shakespeare would throw in, you know, kind of the comic relief in plays that were more serious. And, you know, wondering if that's part of like that at the Regency period, like everybody went to plays and you had to try to please like the upper class people and the people that were, you know, not paying a lot for their tickets and kind of packed into the theater. So that was one thought that I had about that.
Besides Amelia's lightness, charming banter, the butler seems to me a kind of transition between the melodramatic and the comic. He's clearly a comic figure, but he also used to be the Baron's butler, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think I remember that. And he knows what's going on. He's the one reporting on the melodrama in poetry. And that's a little different angle on it than when we hear it enacted, the Baron ranting or whatever.
Yeah, and he was kind of risking his job by doing the poetry when the Baron's telling him, just tell us, you know, tell us directly. Yeah, and there was kind of an interesting meta, like, you know, are there some things that you can't maybe say directly and have to be said in poetry or narrative, you know, like novel narrative versus directly.
So he was like a jester, you think? He was the other baron's old retainer, right? Maybe you couldn't get rid of an old servant very easily. And so he could take more liberties, maybe. I don't really know.
I think so.
How about other questions that seemed interesting to people or thinking about role? Yeah, Wendy?
Well, I guess I'm curious about how much understanding the Mansfield group had of the play they were putting on. There was so much concern about putting on a play, and there was so much difficulty in finding one, and then they settled on Lover's Vows. Do you think that they really knew what they were getting into? Or did Tom know, who had seen it, or the others who had seen it? What do you think that how did that wrap into what happened as the as the story develops, as the play is getting closer to production and then doesn't get produced at Mansfield. What do you all think about that?
Well, Julia is acquainted with the play because she says she hates the character of the coquette. I think Fanny would be the only one who didn't know about the play.
Yeah, and then it also seemed like once they got into the actual dialogue and what they had to say, at least for Mary Crawford, she realized, huh,
Uh-oh.
this is actually a little bit harder to say than I thought it would be. So I think there's probably a way in which the play was pretty well known, but like watching it is different than acting it.
And having to say those words, those speeches.
Yeah.
Can I say that I think that was another way that Austen is torturing Fanny, because Fanny is tortured by having to listen to people say things that are painful for her to hear, and for her to hear Mary saying, oh, I don't know if I can say this in front of Edmund. I mean, can you imagine? Look at this and this. You know, it's just really difficult for Fanny to keep her composure when Mary's going on like that. I think Mary Crawford actually has a lot of sang-froid. She's not easily disconcerted. I think she's putting on a bit of a show there. Well, can I say, I agree that the comic contrast of Rushworth playing the man of the world, the Count, it's very funny.
Yeah, I mean, the Count actually has some funny lines, you know, when he's talking about how, you know, he's a man of the world, and then he kind of has that later on when he and Amelia are talking about Anhalt and talking, you know, he wants to know like, oh, how is Anhalt a good person? And he's has all good qualities except he's not rich. And you know, for the Count, that's the most important thing.
Circling back to Wendy's point about what the characters knew about the play, if you recall the chapter where we go through Othello and all of these other plays, I think it's clear that they all know the plays. A lot of them have seen them, they read them, and that's all they read as far as we know. Because the only other readers I can think of, besides Henry Crawford performing later, but are Fanny and Edmund. Who don't read well. Edmund probably knows some of the plays, but I think they pretty much knew what they were getting into
Until they have to say it out loud to each other.
Could that have been a pose on Mary's part?
Could be, could be. Gets her a lot of attention.
Mm-hmm.
Well, isn't that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Paula Byrne's book really talks about how in that time period, people knew plays in a way that we don't nowadays, like that they were a huge form of entertainment. And so that, you know, if you read Jane Austen's letters, they're all about what plays she's seen and who the actor was that she saw. And so there really is a sense of like plays are so much more a part of sort of the common culture during the Regency period.
I was also knew that at that time, though, actors and actresses themselves were considered kind of lower society, maybe not too moral. And I'm thinking that was one of any play would have been objectionable to some people like the Father, because that was not what good people did. It was just the lower classes that actually acted those out.
Yes, and there were cases where female actors would marry up and, you know, marry someone who was rich and aristocratic, but that was fairly unusual.
In our private theatrical here, I can't imagine that if Sir Thomas had been at home, he probably would have approved, but maybe even for different reasons, not wanting people in the house, wanting a very small circle of people around. But it seems to me in this not in Mansfield Park that the impropriety is more that there's not a guiding hand. The father is away from home. Edmund is dismissed by his brother Tom, who's the acting authoritarian figure, which means the two aunts, the women, are completely useless. So there's not really anyone kind of providing a guiding hand or watching what these characters are up to. So I think that may be partly what Austen is dramatizing.
I thought it more to your point. I think it's really interesting that Tom ends up taking this role as the butler. To me, that just says everything, because he's supposedly the guy in charge.
I was surprised that when I was reading Mansfield Park and with this, that Maria wanted the part of Agatha, that being this mother, and I would assume that she would have to be made up in a rather attractive, unattractive manner, and that Henry was her son. And I was thinking, well, this isn't really a romantic situation, but in reading the play, there's a lot of opportunities for touching, for hugging, for carrying, and and we all know that that wasn't the norm during the Regency, where a woman, an unmarried woman and an unmarried man would have the opportunity to do that type of thing.
Yeah, it seems to me that with both Mariah and Mary Crawford, that they're both choosing roles that there's all this subtext. It basically allows them to enact their feelings towards these men that they can't express another way. But that's why they choose those roles. It really has nothing to do with the play itself.
Yeah, the 1983 adaptation of Mansfield Park has Mariah and Henry, the Mariah and Henry characters actually kiss during the scene, which is not in the play directions. It's that they embrace. But you know, like it's so, there's so much opportunity for them to engage in, yeah, this physical connection and physical closeness that isn't appropriate in that culture.
And just think of all the private rehearsals they could have to work out everything.
How do you think like the play and Fanny connect? Like Fanny has some connection with a couple of the different characters. I think she, you know, connects with Amelia, and I think she also connects with Anholt. Wondering kind of what people think about that.
I think she definitely put character and that sort of thing way above money. And I think that might have resounded with her a little bit, or been part of her character.
And then being in love with a clergyman like Anhalt's really fit in well.
No, the part that they wanted Fanny to play toward the end, because Mrs. Grant couldn't come, the cottager's wife, wouldn't have been a bad one for her. I mean, cottager's wife was kind and helping and things, but I thought it was interesting that she even was a little bit envious of Mrs. Grant, because she was getting some acknowledgement for playing this part. But it said something about she had to base her decisions on what Sir Thomas would think of it. That was the overriding thing as to whether Fanny could do this or not. I don't think it was completely even a moralistic one. I think that she didn't have the freedom of choice to do something like that, like Mrs. Grant did. She was dependent on what Sir Thomas would think of this whole thing.
Yeah, and also feeling like Sir Thomas is at risk of dying anytime. And I think that like the contemporary readers would know that he had that risk because of how much people did die when they were traveling or, going to the West Indies. Cassandra Austen's fiance died over in the West Indies. So I think it's really realistic that he was in danger, and that I think Fanny did have a sense of like that this somehow isn't respectful or taking him into consideration.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point, because we know that Fanny's charmed by the whole aspect of theater. She's in there. She knows the play by heart. She can prompt all of them. And at the end, she's dragged in, but she doesn't seem to have any notion that she couldn't do the cottager's wife. And when I read the play, the cottager's wife, like the butler, has humorous lines. They both perform, they're both not transitional, but communications characters. They actually push the plot along. And the butler's wife is right in there with it. So it's a rather active role. So I think it's not that Fanny didn't appreciate it all. It just seemed to me she couldn't make the distinction maybe between acting and actually being, that she simply couldn't imagine herself performing a role. But
I also wonder if Fanny is illustrative of someone who loves theater in spite of herself. It's like, there are two instances, the actual lover's vows, but then also when Henry Crawford is reading Shakespeare, where she becomes totally enamored of an actor acting. And it's almost like in both of those things, that both of the situations that, Fanny can't help herself. Just like many people, she loves theater. She doesn't even know it, but she does.
And I think she's so human in her response of like, I have this moral sense that I can't do this, but it also fascinates me. I just feel like that's just so human.
Absolutely.
And her feeling left out and feeling insignificant. I just really love how Fanny is like, I'm going to have these contradictory feelings and be totally human, and in how what's going on internally.
She had always been in the background and never acknowledged as a person who would have an opinion about anything. And then to be forced into being on the stage, and not in a big role, of course, but a role where people would be looking at her and hearing her speak her lines. It would be so against what her life had been there, always being in the background and never consulted about anything.
Yes, and I don't know how well she'd pull off a comic line. No shade on Fanny, but I don't know if she really is very comical.
I don't think
Cottager's
so.
Wife is, yeah.
Yeah, because the cottager's wife is pretty assertive and kind of tells the cottager, like tells him what's what.
But Fanny's not a static character. Throughout the book, she keeps speaking more, and notice who she speaks to, speaks against. And so she's developing. And I think that even the experience of the play at this point, at the end of volume 1, helps her with that. But we also know she's highly emotional. She reads, even before the stargazing scene, she quotes poetry, about the avenues going down, connected to Southerton, and she's in raptures sometimes. And later, you mentioned Henry Crawford's performance of Shakespeare being emotionally enticing. So I think that's why I really like the point about Fanny's concern is not necessarily so moral, but more about gratitude and respect for Sir Thomas and what she thinks about him. If you remember, when Edmund first asks her about what she thinks of Mary Crawford now, she does not mention the dirty joke on Rears and Vices. She mentions her disrespect for her guardian, the Admiral, which I think is kind of a piece with this.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Fanny has such clearer sight, I think, of the Crawfords than, anyone else. And yeah, I think there's there's so much subtlety to the way that Austen portrays Mary, and how much you kind of have to read between the lines to know that Mary is not a good match for Edmund. Even though lots of people disagree with me, I firmly think she is bad news.
I totally agree with you. She is bad news.
So one question that I think was really interesting, if you read the play, you see sort of the relationship between the Baron and his daughter Amelia and how they discuss marriage, that Paula Byrne talks about how that's such a contrast with Sir Thomas's discussion about marriage with Maria and with Fanny. And again, if you don't know the play, you're not gonna, because they don't really talk about that in the book, but once you know the play, you can sort of see that challenge or that contrast. Kind of wonder what people's thoughts are about that.
Excuse me, the Baron seems much more liberal in his ideas of happiness for his daughter. He just wants her to be happy, and he'll kind of go along with what she wants. And we know that in Mansfield Park, that was not the case. Fanny was strongly advised to go along with what her uncle wanted, that she was being ungrateful and by not accepting Henry, and her happiness really had no part in the conversation.
Well, the Baron had had an unhappy marriage. He married this woman from Alsace, and apparently that was not a happy marriage. For all the indolence of Lady Bertram, I think that that marriage was happy. He was very overbearing, and she was very submissive. And I think that so they were kind of coming from different perspectives. One had a relatively happy marriage, and the other had a relatively unhappy marriage. And so, what they would be, the advice that they would be giving would come from different perspectives that way, I think.
Good point. Yes.
I think both the Baron and Sir Thomas are a little bit self-deluding, though. Like, I think the Baron says that he wants his daughter to be happy, and he also wants her to marry someone who's rich and you know, has a powerful position. So it's like he wants both things.
And in that light, Sir Thomas wants Fanny to be happy and just assumes that she will learn to love Henry, and that of course they'll be happy, because that's what happens when people get married, is they learn to live with each other and it'll all be fine. And that's probably how he sees it, that chain of events happening.
And let's go over to Pride and Prejudice for Charlotte Lucas's wisdom, which is happiness in marriage is largely a matter of luck. So, you know, all these people are operating without a full deck of cards, I think, in the marriage world. And are we doing any better now? Maybe not. But I was really intrigued, Michelle, with your statement about your strong statement about Mary would not have been good for Edmund. And I've been ruminating on that. I know it's off topic, but did you want to add any more to that?
I think her like biggest flaw is that she doesn't accept Edmund as who he is. You know, she belittles him for wanting to be a clergyman. She thinks that he should be trying to be rich and powerful. And I think like someone who goes into marriage thinking, like not understanding where your spouse is coming from is bad news. So
Or thinking you can change him after marriage.
I think Mary gets kind of a bad rap in a lot of respects. If you were a female during this period of time, everything about the rest of your life was going to be defined by who you married. You were basically giving over your entire existence to them. Your money was not your own, your children were not your own, your body was not your own. And why would you do that with no investment in the future of your marriage partner? She may care about Edmund, she may be attracted to Edmund, but at the end of the day, if Edmund is not going to be what she needs, then she needs to move on. So she's seen as really really a not very empathetic character, I guess, a lot of times. But I given when she's living, I kind of understand where she's coming from.
She's not completely mercenary. I mean, she does care for Edmund. Like you said, she cares for Edmund and is attracted to him. She just wishes he was more ambitious, because that's what she thinks would ensure their happiness in the future. I mean, she's to be completely mercenary would be to say, well, he is what he is, and I'm just going to walk away because he's not good enough. I'm going to find someone who makes more money, or has more money. Um, she could have gone after Tom. He was the older son who would inherit the estate, but she
Right.
didn't. She never went after Tom. That would have been the mercenary move. So yeah, I mean, I don't think she's completely bad, but I don't think she would have made Edmund happy either.
Yeah, she's complex, and I think the portrayal of her is complex, and that's why it's, it's not that Edmund was blind and the signs were super, super obvious. I think it was more subtle than that.
Mhm.
But I think Fanny could see it because she really loved Edmund and wanted, and I think if Mary had been a good match for Edmund, she would have, found a way to suffer but be okay with Edmund marrying Mary if that was okay.
I always think of Edmund as in many ways is a really good person and wanting to serve other people and so on. And I just think that Mary kind of in the very beginning, like which of the brothers should I go for? And then when Tom was so very sick, thinking, oh, goody, now Edmund will be in charge. So I don't like her as well as most people do. I just like good people, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of think I've always thought that Mary and Henry were very much alike. I mean, yes, they're brother and sister, but they both have this. It's not well. I think it's just a selfishness, for lack of a better description. You know, they really don't put the other person first in a lot of ways. They do on the surface, but actually everything they do is for their own entertainment or their own needs. And we're all selfish in that way. So it's very human. But I just think they ultimately they choose the choices that they make and the things that they do are all centered around self-interest. And I think Edmund is a much better person than that, just like Fanny is a much better person. So Austen has them pair up, and then, Henry goes off and does his thing, which ends up disastrously, but you could kind of see it coming with Maria.
That depends, I think, so much on where we are in the novel. Because Austen is, and it's always good to remember that at the beginning, we see both Mary and Henry struggling some with assumptions that they've had about money and class and life in the city. Henry kind of imagining himself being good for Fanny and Fanny being good for him. They're tested. Mary never gives up the hope that Edmund will find a rich relative or something like that. And of course, she lands right on the possibility that Tom might die. And that's, of course, when Fanny tells him that. That's kind of the last straw for Edmund. But they're really tested throughout here. And I think all of that begins in this section of the Lover's Vow chapters. So we see temptations in various directions for people. And it's interesting to track how they manage those as you go through the rest of the novel.
That's a good point.
Yeah, like Fanny having to stand up for herself here is sort of the prologue to her having to stand up to herself to say, no, I don't want to marry Henry. And Fanny she's hesitant to tell Edmund like how wrong he is. But finally, by the time she's discussing the Henry's proposal, she's able to tell Edmund, like, no, I don't want to marry Henry, and that's it.
Even though she can't fully explain why. She hints 2 or 3 times as the book goes along that she's noticed things. Haven't you noticed that maybe Henry would be more interested in Maria if she weren't engaged. And Edmund shrugs that off. So one of Fanny's roles is educating characters around her, I think.
Fanny is such a strong moral compass to Edmund that when he's trying to decide if he can take this role, and he goes to Fanny and gives her all the arguments about why he should and how it would be so much worse. But he can't make that decision on his own. He has to present it to Fanny and get her approbation also. He doesn't have the strength of his convictions that Fanny does by any means.
Well, I also think he looks to her for, oddly enough, for some moral guidance. I mean, he knows that she has, you know, strength and conviction, and, you know, sees things clearly. I think he does on some level.
Yeah, we see in sort of when Fanny's 15 and he's trying to convince her that she'll be good with Aunt Norris, because Aunt Norris wanting Fanny to live with her shows that Aunt Norris is thinking rightly. And Fanny like knows that he's so wrong, but she just says, oh, Edmund must be right, I must be wrong. Yeah. And so she gets this sort of development of, oh, I need to trust my own judgment because Edmund is not always right. And that, you know, is sort of like her arc of development as a character.
I think this conversation links to one way that Fanny and Amelia are rather alike, because at least by the end of the play, and Amelia, I think we can kind of track through Lover's Vows as testing her own self. Remember, she's lovesick, but she doesn't understand why at one point. It's a little high. We've already been told gradually how much she esteems Anne Holt. But so there's a teeny little bit of development there. But finally, she's the one speaking up both to Edmund and to her father, saying, well, let a woman teach you. You know, I'm going to educate you. And interestingly enough, that's the arc of Fanny's development as well. She speaks a little more bravely from being the outsider and timid. I mean, she's still an outsider, but her development in that arena is really strong.
And Edmund has to make that change, has to shift that, his view of her, where, you know, he has to shift from the mentor role to the lover role and sort of see her as an equal, not as his student.
We don't ever see that. We're just told.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see it a little bit in when he's trying to consult with her about things, where he's, you know, beginning to sort of want her opinion, and sort of wants to confide in her, which that does feel like that's more of an equal relationship. It's painful for her because a lot of it's about Mary.
Mm-hmm.
We also saw Fanny home again with her father and her mother, and so she had a real vivid picture of a no good leader in the family, her husband, father, and it may have kind of given her some extra strength besides just I want to get out of here, to aid her sister for one thing, but also to get back over to Mansfield Park.
And maybe helped her, yeah, appreciate kind of, even though Mansfield Park was hard, there were parts of it you know, it wasn't as awful as if she had stayed at her house. And I think, again, I don't think that's at all like a class or a poverty question. I think it's a like moral character of her parents question. I don't think Fanny rejected them because they were impoverished. I think it was because they, you know, didn't try to make things better and had favorites and were just not good parents.
I was reminded, though, how little Fanny was looked after at Mansfield Park, that she couldn't, reminded us of her room not being heated, that Miss Norris said. And nobody contradicted Miss Norris. Nobody paid any attention to that. It was often not direct meanness like Mrs. Norris had, but just sort of a neglect that Fanny felt.
Yeah, I kind of wondered because Edmund clearly knew that she didn't have a fire because he would tell her, don't stay there to be cold. And I wondered if, like, sort of the hierarchy of I have to respect my elders meant that he couldn't contradict Aunt Norris, if like that was why he, you know, because so it's like he clearly knew that that was a problem. Yeah, so it is kind of curious, like,
Yeah, I have always wondered about that fact that she went years, 8 years or whatever it was, from the age of 10 with no fire in her room. It's just beyond my comprehension.
Her parents' establishment and Mansfield Park are neglectful environments. It's just that Mansfield Park is more structured. So
well, and it has Edmund, so emotionally,
Right.
it's not neglectful in a way that her home was.
But even Edmund is neglectful of her. He takes her horse for Mary and leaves her for days with only Aunt Norris walking her back and forth for exercise. And you know, the whole situation with Edmund and Mary, I've always felt kind of bad that, you know, and I know it's I've always felt kind of bad that there was no other option for Fanny other than Edmund, because it's too bad that she has to be the second choice. Fanny should be the first choice. And that's just always felt wrong to me.
But isn't that such an Austen theme, the second choice of love, whether it's Sense and Sensibility and Marianne, whether it's Persuasion and Eliot. I don't know. I just thought that was always a big theme for Austen that goes through all of the novels in very different ways.
Yeah, you might be right.
I feel like Edmund's arc is similar to like Emma's arc in Emma, in that she has to realize that Frank Churchill is no good, and you know, realize the virtue of Mr. Knightley. And I think, yeah, Edmund has to, I think there's something believable about him being attracted to Mary and, you know, seeing her as someone that he'd be interested in. You know, like we don't really know that where, you know, it sounds like that's maybe his first romantic relationship. So hardly anyone gets it right the first time. So I think that that's, you know, probably pretty realistic, actually.
going back a bit,
I think that second choice thing throughout Austen is an interesting thing. Like even in Pride and Prejudice, she liked Wickham before she liked Darcy, and the and like you brought out Mary Ann, and it, Mary Ann and Willoughby before Brandon, and what was in Emma. I guess, yeah, but she never was really sure about Frank Churchill. It seemed like she kept going back, do I love him? It was almost a sense of she didn't know what love was, and other people thought she should love him. So, okay, we'll see if I love Frank Churchill. But I hadn't thought of that as much as a theme in Jane Austen until you brought that up, that is a recurrent theme. Catherine Morland liked Tilney before, that was the first love, but she was extremely young, wasn't she, like 17 or something?
Yeah.
And
So was Mary Ann was 17.
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes we do forget how young these heroines are. And when I think of myself at that age, which was very, very long ago, but we sometimes maybe judge them a little harshly, forgetting how young they are. And some of the guys too, actually.
Yeah, I don't think Austen really buys into the notion that, your first love is always the best love. And that, there's a sense that like you really have to be careful and get to know someone.
Well, and you see that in Pride and Prejudice too. I mean, Elizabeth and Darcy fight. They, they have this whole, what would have been a very kind of non-traditional relationship. They fight, she turns him down. They have this whole back and forth all through the book. It's not I mean, it is what romantic comedies are based on. Boy meets girl, boy and girl hate each other. Gradually they come back together. So it's, yeah.
I'd like to go to Mariah and Mr. Rushworth, because to me that's kind of interesting too. Their parts in the play and then what happens with them. And her father asking her for sure, and she says yes. I don't know if it's the money or what. And that to me is kind of interesting too, as it contrasts with Lover's Vows.
Yeah, like she's a fallen woman, but she's in no other way like Agatha in Lover's Vows, because Agatha is portrayed as highly virtuous, even though she made this mistake. And Mariah is not virtuous, and kind of a victim of her feelings, I think, that
Well, it goes back to the part where she wasn't really taught. I mean, Sir Thomas says it, or we get his thoughts at the end that he never really taught them right from wrong in a way. He just kind of let his children do what they were going to do and didn't really provide that sort of instruction.
And their mother certainly didn't.
Yeah, she didn't do anything.
don't play with Pug. That's what she taught them.
Mhm.
Yeah. Give birth and lie on the couch.
And in the same way that, I mean, we've talked about the blind spot, and Edmund may not have a blind spot so much about Mrs. Norris, except that his father respects her. Jean?
Should I come and clear it?
No, this is, I'm not going to go to the bathroom right now. I'm on a Zoom.
Okay, can you clear it for me?
I was just going to note the move toward the similarity between the Baron in Lover's Vows and Sir Thomas, in that the Baron would really like I mean, it gets a little messy. He wants Anhold to reform Count Castle so that he'll be a little less of a fop, and thinks that he can still marry his daughter for the wealth and the connections. His daughter, however much she understands clearly right from the start that she's not interested in the Count, that she recognizes his foolishness, and her father doesn't seem to respond to that overly, but he's in agreement with it. Sir Thomas, but anyway, he ends up not being able to read his daughter very well. She has to hit him over the head finally with the notion of what she wants to do, which of course isn't the usual comic ending. And Sir Thomas recognizes very belatedly that he has trusted Mrs. Norris as a wife substitute to deal with his daughters, and that he doesn't get them at all. He recognizes when he talks to Maria that he just missed that he should. I mean, he does not understand where she's coming from whatsoever, and he is aware of that finally.
Too little, too late.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think there are ways in which Sir Thomas has very low self-knowledge, and thinks that he sees clearly, thinks that he's not mercenary and thinking about marriages, and the way like the narrator will give you sort of his pre and direct discourse about like kind of casually noticing that Henry seems to be interested in Fanny, and oh, maybe I'll have a ball. So like he's pretty calculating and manipulative, but doesn't think that he is. And I think there's just such subtlety in the way that Austen portrays that is, I think, just fascinating.
To go back for a second to the second love theory that we've been seeing through the books, I think that that's really important because, as you were saying earlier, when a woman marries, she gives up everything to her husband, and she needs to be sure it's the right husband.
Yeah. And I think the most important question for Austen about men is, do they understand what it's like to be a woman? Do they understand what it's like to be sort of not powerful in society? And like that's partly why Darcy's first proposal, he's so awful, is because he doesn't show any kind of understanding of what it's like to be Elizabeth.
Right.
He
Get
just thinks
married
he's
at that
conferring
point.
an honor. He's honoring her by stooping down to her level.
Yeah, in spite of her mother, or in spite of her family.
You think that Austen meant for us to be as hard on Edmund as we are? We have other characters in the other books being dazzled by another character, but we're very hard on Edmund as a group now, and in our time period. Do you think that Austen would have felt that way, or do you think that Edmund was a young girl's dream, the good clergyman who finally gave up the Jezebel because he saw her true colors?
I don't think there are any really good clergymen in Austen. I mean, and just kind of going through, Henry Tilney isn't bad, but I think over time, they're married 10 or 15 years, he's going to become like, the mansplaining is going to become too much for Catherine. But look at the clergymen that she comes up with. I mean, I think Edmund is less odious than Mr. Collins, certainly, and not as bad as, I'm forgetting the clergyman in Emma.
Mr. Elton.
Mr. Elton, right. But not the screen Edward, but the book Edward, as he proposes to Eleanor, is and I never noticed this, but I was reading something, and he's cutting up, he's using scissors to cut up, he calls it a sheath, but he's cutting this thing up as he's proposing to her. I mean, Edward, I don't think Edward is really I don't know how happy Eleanor is going to be long-term with Edward. I think she had some really strong opinions on the clergy and the church for whatever reason. Her father was a clergyman, but
I think Edmund is portrayed as someone who's very sincere in his religious beliefs, and that, you know, he sees that as a vocation. I think with Henry Tilney, we don't get a sense that like he thinks of himself as a clergyman or sees that as like, you know, he's got a curate that does the work, but Edmund really seems like, no, you got to live with the people. You got to show them a good example. You got to be their friend. So I think in a way that maybe we don't see in some of the other novels, he really fleshes out like, hey, this is what kind of clergyman I would be. And I think it's the kind that Jane Austen thinks would be good.
that's a good point.
I think for Edmund, it was a calling. For Tilney, it was a job.
Yeah,
I've heard in Jane Austen's books and things that Edmund was her favorite hero. And so I think she expected us to like him. But I feel like the reason why we don't like him as much in our day and age is because he is the hero. If he was a villain who was treating like his sister this way, we might be less inclined to judge him. But because he's supposed to be the romantic lead, I think that tempers our view of Edmund.
I agree that I think Edmund is probably Austen's model clergyman, but I think it increases his interest and importance that he's capable of being charmed by Mary Crawford. He's not very good at dealing with it. He kind of understands that. He will rationalize it just a little bit. Fanny asks, how she can say such a thing, or she has the privilege of a lively mind. And I mean, Elizabeth Bennet, it's tempting for a lot of people to see them in much the same mold. But just the charming nature and bewitchment. I think that the whole role of the plays in here also. Why are plays so intriguing? They do bewitch us. They take us into a different zone, a little magic world for a while, and then set us back out. And I think kind of that's what happens with Edmund, with Mary Crawford. But there's a much bigger gender picture here. Even at the end of Lover's Vows, when Amelia seems to be more or less in charge, using a string of characters, including the butler and Frederick, the Baron is humbled to an extent that he becomes reformed. But he still says to Frederick that, here, my daughter shall pay my debt. She still belongs to him. There are class things that he just can't get beyond, and that the play's certainly not going to. We really notice a lot of those things today, I think.
Another thing, Edmund was brought up to think of Fanny as a sister, and so it would have to take, I think if he had had some more of a revelation of Fanny as a love, a amorous love object. But you know how Austen kind of hurries her finishes sometimes, and so I think we didn't get that sudden, oh, I love her. It was just, he realized her value or something. But I think we wanted him to have this big, oh, I didn't realize how much I really loved her moment.
That's kind of like Edward Ferrars. Most readers are really not satisfied by the ending of Sense and Sensibility. Eleanor takes him, and a lot of us think, why?
I think Edward has more of a sense of humor than people give him credit for. And
Edward or Edmund?
Edward.
Yeah, I agree.
And he and Eleanor have sort of that wry sense of humor. And I think, like in both books, there's a sense in which we have to trust that Fanny and Eleanor kind of know what's good for them. And we have to sort of trust, like, they've chosen these men, and so that's their choice. So we, like, I think, yeah, there's not a sense of but especially with Edward, that their change is dramatized in the novel. But part of it, I think, is like just that we have to accept that Eleanor and Fanny have good judgment, and that the choice that they made is actually going to make them happy.
I want to say one thing about Edmund being so infatuated by Mary Crawford, because he doesn't really understand about her and who she is. It kind of reminds me of Elizabeth Bennet being so infatuated by Wickham. Because she doesn't know who he really is. And she finds him lots of fun to be around, just like Edmund finds Mary Crawford fun to be around. And then when Elizabeth does find out the truth from Mr. Darcy about who he really is, she completely changes her view. And it's sort of like what's going to happen with Mary Crawford then, when Edmund realizes really who Mary Crawford is, and then he's going to change his mind about her. But for both of them, their first interests, their first love interests, and they're all very young.
Isn't that what people say, that if you choose your marriage partner when you're young, you pick your opposite?
Or you pick your father.
Yeah. And if you're more mature years, you've learned that you probably better pick somebody you're compatible with.
It's always hard to get to know the real person, I think.
Yes.
Austen would tell us.
And I think
it takes time.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that somebody was making about Eleanor and Fanny picking somebody that would be good for them, because they were both of mature judgment, even though they were young.
Yes.
Not as much maybe Eleanor, but and the fact that they could actually choose their marriage partner, there wasn't anybody pressuring them or imposing on them, or poverty, impelling them. It's a good thought, I think.
How about thinking about like just that sort of question of like, does reading Lover's Vows bring any more complexity to thinking about Mansfield Park for people? Maybe appreciation for the genius of Jane Austen?
I think it probably brings out the elements that she wanted us to concentrate on. Illuminates them.
When the people are discussing what parts they want or don't want, or what plays they want to play, Fanny's the observer. She's really amused at how people are trying to appear gracious, but they're really maneuvering for themselves. And then there's the scene when Mary comes in the evening and, oh, okay, I'm going to be Amelia, but oh, who's going to be my Anhalt? And she's just a little bit, I mean, she's a mixed character. She's not, an out and out villainess. Austen is so subtle. She shows this real person who's being just a little bit disingenuous as she goes to Edmund to say, what do you think I should do for an Anhalt? So I think that the play and the whole set piece of the play shows real flawed people interacting with each other in a way that it was so sophisticated for the time, for novels of the time.
Yeah, and later we see, when Mary's talking to Fanny about the play at a much later point, and she talks about Edmund's sturdy spirit to bend, that, we see how much Mary was being manipulative to try to get Edmund to play Anhalt. And, it's like there's hints of it in when they're planning the play, but then it really becomes clearer towards the end when Mary and Fanny have their sort of goodbye scene together.
I think that's right. Yeah, I was struck by Amelia in Lover's Vows. I was thinking of her that she should be more the way I was thinking of Mary Crawford, even in this section about just what we were talking about, casting, dealing with Edmund, that I thought Amelia would be a little bit more sexualized and less innocent. I mean, she's the one we really do kind of track a little bit of her recognition that she's seeing Anhalt as more than her tutor, that in comparison to Count Castle is totally different. And she recognizes at some point that she tells her father, I love you and I love him, and it's different. And I mean, there are a couple of examples I could give of that, but I think you'd think I'm cracked. One of them is Dirty Dancing. I wondered why people would watch that movie 38 times. And I realized that I think young women were so stunned by and awakened by the young woman making her father accept her sexuality. And so, but anyway, I think that, I really think Amelia, even in this kind of expurgated version, is a little radical in that way. And even recognizing it, but saying it to her father as well. But she had the confidence that her father always wanted her to tell him the truth, etc. But I thought that I was really quite charmed myself by Amelia in Lover's Vows. And she's a little bit different from the Mary we're seeing playing Amelia.
Yeah, there's an innocence and straightforwardness to Amelia that Mary doesn't have. Any closing thoughts? Any
I just wanted to tell a lot of you that some of the remarks have made me think about things in a new and different angle, and it's really been interesting. I really like that because I just read it mainly for the fun, I guess.
And even today, Lover's Vows is a dangerous play. There's an anthology called Jane Austen Sex and Romance. More romance than the other, thank goodness. But an English professor put on this version in Chott, of all places. And pretty soon, the Edmund character, like the Mary character, who didn't care that Edmund liked her, and the Fanny character was very upset. So all their acting was not working out. It was a big crisis. And finally, she had a big talk with the Edmund character. Just go for it. Just do your bit. And so apparently it worked out in the end. But those triangles were there in the modern version.
I just wanted to say.
Go ahead, sorry.
I just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to read Lover's Vows, because I've always wanted to do that and I've just never taken the time. So this has been great fun. Thanks.
It was a quick read. It was, I think, a quicker read than I thought it was or remembered it being, because I've read it several times in the past and then reread it a couple of times. And it was pretty quick.
But it definitely makes reading Mansfield Park, it adds a really interesting layer of information and interest there.
Definitely, yeah.
Finally, I'm amused by the fact that we haven't talked about Yeats at all. And in fact, he was offended that he had to play Count Castle at whatever their aristocratic production. And he wanted to rant as the Baron. And the Baron, while he has his moments, isn't all that much a ranter. So you can just imagine the way Yeats was playing him. And he's really quite a comic character. And the narrator, we all can't ever forget the narrator, pokes a lot of fun at him early on. When he shows up with Tom at the beginning, he was, remember, he was so downcast about not being to put on Lover's Vows. And he was the whole party would have been immortalized for at least a 12-month. And the narrator comments on Tom's friend Yates coming, his new intimate friend. So she really has a lot of fun with him. And I think that she has a lot of fun thinking about Yates playing the Baron.
Well, and the fact that Yates ends up with Julia.
Yeah.
Who's kind of histrionic in some of her, I'm not going to play her. I'm not going to play anyone. So that they're a good match. If anyone has not seen the 1983 Mansfield Park, the person who plays Mr. Yates has this hair that kind of looks like Rod Stewart from the 70s. And he's overdressed and he rants. It's so funny. You have to find it and watch it because it's just hilarious. All right. I'm going to stop the recording.